I'm noticing we're a minute past. I haven't heard from anybody in the room yet. Are y'all there?
Chair Losfeld, we just turned on the
Can see but not hear you.
Can you hear us now, Chair Losfeld? Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so you have the script and we are on air.
And I'm going to go with the new format. I'm going to be bold tonight.
All right.
You all right with that?
I'm all up for it.
Okay, good evening, commissioners. All right, let's get started then. Good evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome you to the regular meeting of the Milwaukie Planning Commission. Agendas and additional copies of staff reports are available on the city website at www.milwaukieoregon.gov. You may locate them by navigating to the community calendar where tonight's meeting page is posted. If you have not reviewed the agenda, please do so. It contains important information about the process this evening. Moving on to the native land acknowledgement. The city of Milwaukie respectfully acknowledges that our community is located on the ancestral homeland of the Clackamas people. In 1855, the surviving members of the Clackamas signed the Willamette Valley Treaty, also known as the Caliupa Treaty, with the federal government in good faith. We offer our respect and our gratitude to the indigenous people of this land. Moving on to the minutes. Moving on to the approval, hopefully, of the October 11th, 2022 meeting minutes. Do any of our commissioners have any corrections to note? Hearing none, and
Chair, I would like to make a motion to accept the October 11th, 2022 minutes as presented.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
All right, I have a second. As are all those in favor, please state aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye. 5. All opposed, please state nay. All right, hearing none opposed, that's unanimous. We have approval of the minutes from October 11th, 2022. We'll move on to informational items. Are there any informational items from staff tonight?
Yes, I have 2 informational items. One, I just wanted to let you all know that the City Council reviewed the high-density residential zones consolidation work that we had worked on here. They reviewed that on December 6th, and they moved to approve moving from 3 zones to 1 zone, 4 to 1. So there'll be a second and final reading on December 13th. So just wanted you all to know that. I mean, December 20th. Today is December 13th, sorry. And then the second announcement is, of course, that our colleague here, Commissioner Massey, has been elected to City Council. Congratulations. It's very exciting. We're so excited to get to continue to work with you as staff moving forward. So fabulous. And we do have another candidate that will be starting with us, a new planning commissioner that will be stepping up at the first meeting in the new year. That's what I've got for informational items.
Awesome. Congratulations, Commissioner Massey. Congratulations. Your list is added to one of past commissioners moving on to great things, and look forward to seeing you in your new position.
Appreciate that. We got a great farm system here.
That's right. That's right. We do. And really excited to hear City Council moving forward with some of the recommendations and thoughts from this group. So that's great work too. All right, moving on then to audience participation. This is an opportunity to comment on items not on tonight's agenda. Does any audience member wish to comment on an item that is not on tonight's commission agenda? And Laura, I'll just ask you if there's anyone physically in the room or virtually that you're note of.
We do not have anyone physically in the room, nor do we have anyone online that would like to participate.
Okay, well. Their loss, right? Okay, I'm gonna skip 4.0 then and go directly to 5. 5 is Community Involvement Advisory Committee, the CIAC. At this point in the agenda, the commission will act as the Community Involvement Advisory Committee. Does staff have any updates?
I do, actually. I wanted to just give a little follow-up from our meeting on October 11th. I said I would do that last time we were together. It's a follow-up to the joint meeting between the Planning Commission and the NDAs. I kind of identified 5 to-do items, so I wanted to just let you know what those are and kind of give you a time frame when we're going to work on them. So there was a request to host an in-person land use one-on-one training, and that we were going to do. We will do that in the spring, so that is on the docket. And included in that will be kind of an explanation about the timeline for development projects once an application is approved. That was a specific request. Another one was a specific request to clarify, to teach people what the Planning Commission does and does not do as part of that training, so to kind of get people familiar with that. So we'll include that. We'll also provide, Commissioner Eric, you'd asked about some sort of little mini explanation, an overview, a few slides, and a slide deck that we can put online. We will do that as well as part of our spring work, so that is on our agenda. Then there was a request to provide a quarterly update on significant development projects in the NDA Friday notes that go out from Jason. So we will do that at the beginning of the year just to give an update on what's happening now. We'll try to do that at the beginning of each quarter. Then there was the idea of discussing the possibility with the city attorney to provide brief, easy understand guidance on what is appropriate during public testimony portion of public hearings. And so Justin and I have started talking about that, and we're coming up with some ideas, and then we'll work through them with the chair and then bring kind of that language to you all in the spring as well in the next couple of months. Then the fourth item was to create a document, some sort of presentation that explains to the NDAs, like when you get notified about what types of land use and then what you need to do when you get notified of those land use, whether you're on opposition or whether you're supportive, and what is the best way to get to go through that process and provide comments. And so we're going to put together something around that topic. And we will probably both do it as a printed something that you can find online. We'll probably put together a little slide presentation. And then if neighborhood associations want, we can also go out and do that in person or virtually. So we'll come up with a plan for that. But we understood what you're requesting, and we've been wanting to do that anyway. So we're putting it on our docket to work on. And then there was one last comment about how was Milwaukie involved with looking and reviewing TriMet's concept plan. And I reached out to Kelly Brooks, who's the person here at the city who is responsible for that relationship. And she has been involved in that process and actually attended like a 2-day workshop at the beginning of it and felt pretty comfortable with what was being talked about. But if you do have any specific questions or concerns, you can email Kelly and she can share those with TriMet. And so that was just what I had as a follow-up to that meeting. Are there any other outstanding items that you all, looks like what we got in the notes, but that I didn't capture?
I've just got a question for you that, you just rattled off like 6 or 8 different active things that you all are working through. And I'm glad you're, tracking those and following up. Laura, how can we continue to be updated on the progress of each one of those elements and not really lose track about them?
Sure, yeah. I can, once we get a little bit closer, my goal is to be working on these things over the January, February, and March. So getting to some sort of presentation by the end of the first quarter of next year. So what I could do possibly is maybe just in February, that first meeting in February, just let you know, like, we're halfway through developing this. We do still have a rollout date that we're shooting for. So I'm happy to continue to update you, just so, yes, we do not lose sight of these things. No problem at all.
That'd be great.
Yep.
Do other commissioners have questions or comments?
I do, but it's semi-unrelated to the subject that is at hand right now.
So that's maybe, do CIAC members have any items to report? How about that, Greg?
I do. So Linwood NDA has a couple of interesting projects that are in pre-application right now. And as I intend my NDA, one, I want to give a big shout out and a big thank you to Brett because I think he's involved in both of them. He communicated really, really well with our land use chair and kind of helped them walk through the issues. And one of the projects had a natural resource deal tied to it, which has always been, I've argued about this ditch for years, but that's okay. That was just noticed as a decision a couple of days ago, but it leads to this bigger project. And so one of the things that, and I think that you kind of touch on this, but we need to emphasize, especially to our chairs and to the people that are presenting this, what happened at the Linwood NDA is that the chair basically said, well, if you have that issue about the sidewalk, go ahead and send it in on this natural resource deal. And I had to hold everybody back and say, no, look, you have to be sure that you are only commenting on what is presented in front of you. And I also want to give a big shout out to the person that is working on Stanley. He did come to our NDA meeting and help us kind of understand the project a little bit more. I'm sure it's still in the early phases. And so, yes, I would also like to continue to encourage the staff to ask these developers to come in front of their NDAs, especially during pre-application times. And my only other comment is that I must commend this planning department on their customer service. Every time that we have somebody that comes up here, Brian even said it during our NDA meeting, that you are, and I heard it last night at the historic meeting, that you guys are the best staff to work with in the metro area. And that says a lot. And so thank you for your continued and wonderful service.
Thank you. We appreciate that. We work really hard, so we appreciate that. Thank you.
Agreed, underscored, underlined. Thank you, Commissioner Hewer. Are there other commissioners? I'm hearing silence, so I'm going to take that as a no. Okay, we have no audience, so I'm going to skip that question to the audience about their own participation in this point. And I'm going to move on in the agenda. Directly to hearing items. So first off is variance for an existing warehouse in the Tacoma Station Mixed-Use Zone. The next agenda item is a hearing on the variance request in the Tacoma Station Mixed-Use Zone. The public hearing on the variance request for an existing warehouse in the Tacoma Station Mixed-Use Zone is called to order. Gavel. The purpose of the hearing is to consider application number VR-2022-009 and Dev DEV-2002-003. A variance request on the property located at 2107, 2149, and 2171 Southeast Moore Street. The applicant has the burden of proving the application is consistent with the city's zoning, subdivision ordinance, comprehensive plan, and applicable municipal code provision, and that the proposal conforms to the city's applicable criteria. I now ask staff to cite the zoning ordinance section where the criteria can be found.
Thank you, Chair. The applicable sections of the Milwaukie Municipal Code for this particular application are MMC Section 19312, MMC subsection 19504, MMC Chapter 19600, MMC Chapter 19700, MMC Section 19906, MMC Section 19911, and finally MMC Section 191,006.
Thank you. All right, conduct of the hearing. All testimony and evidence must be directed toward the applicable substantiative criteria. Failure to address the criterion or raise an issue with sufficient detail to allow the Planning Commission an adequate opportunity to respond to each issue precludes appeal to City Council based on that issue. Failure to raise constitutional or otherwise issue related to proposed conditions of approval for a sufficient detail to allow a response precludes an action of damages in circuit court. Any party withstanding may appeal the decision of the Planning Commission to the City Council. Persons withstanding are those who submit comments or testify. We will recognize those persons submitting testimony. Please state your name and city of residence for the record so that they may be entered into the minutes. If you are here to testify, please remember to confine your remarks to the application and relevant criteria and avoid repetitious and non-relevant information. The moderator may mute you if disruptions occur. All right. If additional documents or evidence are provided by any party, the commission may, if requested, allow a continuance or leave the record open to allow the parties reasonable opportunity to respond. Any such continuance of extension shall be subject to the limitations of the 120-day rule unless the continuance or extension is requested or agreed to by the applicant. Let's start with conflicts of interest, please. Does any member of the commission wish to abstain from this hearing? Please state so verbally.
No.
No. No. Okay, great. Seeing none, thank you. Some shaking heads on Zoom. Does any member of the commission wish to declare an actual or potential conflict of interest? Hearing none, seeing none. Does any member of the commission wish to report an ex parte contact? Hearing none and saying none. Okay. Will any commissioner who has visited the site prior to the hearing, please raise your hand. Commissioner Ernst, did I see your hand? Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you to those who did. Question to you all. Did any commissioner who visited the site speak to anyone at the site or know anything different from what is indicated on the staff report for this application? No. 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 Commissioner Massey, I believe your head is shaking no, so thank you. Does any member of the audience wish to challenge the participation of the members of this planning commission? I'll give just a moment if we have new members in the audience. Okay, I'll move on. Does any member of the audience wish to challenge the jurisdiction of the planning commission to hear this matter? Okay, I'll move on. Let's proceed to the staff report.
Great, thank you. One moment and I'll share my screen. Okay, can everyone on Zoom see the presentation?
The head nodding.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Yeah, we're seeing the presenter's view. So we see your slide, the next slide and the notes and everything.
Oh, strange. Okay, let me try this one more time. Sorry about that.
That is not what we see in the room, so we'll try to figure that out.
Try share screen to you. There we go. Okay, how about now?
That's better. That's better. Thank you.
Lovely. Okay. So before you today is a request for a variance with the file number VR-2022-009. This is an application for the property with the address 2149 Southeast Moore Street. Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties on this side. There we go. Okay, so this property is roughly an acre in size when you consider there are 3 underlying lots. So I think it's lots 17, 18, and 19 that were created through the Selwood Gardens subdivision, which was platted in 1911. Currently, the property has a number of uses, residential dwelling, a beauty salon, and the primary use, which is Alpha Stoneworks, which is a countertop fabricator. regarding the site, there are currently the property developed over time. And so there are a number of aspects of the site that are considered non-conforming with the code. That includes various aspects of the parking area, floor area ratio for the site as a whole, although the center property actually does meet the FAR requirement. The various design standards that are specific to the North Milwaukie innovation area, and then in addition to that, some site landscaping. What is sort of getting to the zoning in the vicinity? This is part of the Tacoma Station area mixed-use zone. Below that, you have the North Milwaukie Employment Zone. And then sort of to the northwest, you have City of Portland, which is buffered from the subject property by the Springwater Corridor. You also have some properties zoned much farther to the east that are zoned moderate density residential, but those are also buffered by all of McLaughlin Boulevard, as well as additional industrial properties and a rail line. The proposal is to add a roughly 2,400 square foot warehouse addition to the existing warehouse fabrication space. You can see in the image on the screen sort of roughly where that addition is proposed. The request involves 3 different variances, 2 related to specific design standards in the NMIA zone, and also a setback reduction, which is a little bit more complicated than that I'll get into in just a moment. So the applicant has proposed, as stated earlier, development review was part of this. So the applicant has proposed to address some of the existing nonconformities on the site. That includes adding 11 new striped parking spaces, restriping the existing 4 spaces that are in front of the property, 2 in front of Alpha Stoneworks itself, and then 2 in front of the beauty salon. In addition, adding new perimeter landscaping where new parking is proposed on 2107 Southeast Moores, adding 4 new bicycle parking spaces, 2 in front of the Alpha Stoneworks storefront, and then 2 located on the property farthest to the west, and more geared towards employees, and then has also offered to refresh some of the existing landscaping perimeter on 2171, which is the property farthest to the east, and refresh some of the landscaping area in front of the Alpha Stoneworks storefronts, the historic house, and as well as the beauty salon. As mentioned, there are 3, this application is before you today because there are 3 separate variance requests. The first 2, as mentioned, are related to specific design standards. So the first one, I'll just kind of walk through each. The first one requires that at least 30% of the ground floor wall area consist of openings in the form of windows or doors. The second requires that new construction utilize high quality materials on facades that are visible. There's a sort of breakdown structure in terms of primary, secondary, and accent materials that are permitted in 19.3.12. That's a typo. It's 19.3.12, not 19.3.17. And then finally, there is a requirement that in zones where there is not a side or a rear yard setback required, which is the case in the Tacoma Station Mixed-Use Zone, that building must be either erected on a property line or 3 feet from a property line. So the applicant is not 100% confident that they will need to utilize an approval for this variance. However, it could be the case that where they're proposing to place their warehouse addition could come within 2 feet of the rear property line. So as you're all familiar with, there are specific approval criteria for variances that are seeking discretionary relief. So the application must show that the proposal meets each of these 3 criteria. The first is providing an alternative analysis of the impacts and the benefits. The second is that the variance is both reasonable, appropriate, and meets one or more of the following criteria. And then finally, that where possible, the applicant is mitigating the impacts of any proposed variance. So getting to sort of staff's recommendation for recommending approval, when it comes to the design standards, the actual subsection as well as the NMIA plan discuss kind of the intent behind these requirements that, you know, a ground floor walls provide a certain percentage of openings in the form of windows and doors, and also that those same facades use attractive materials. And when you get into it, it's really about creating an attractive pedestrian environment, trying to minimize large blank expanses in the area. And because of the proposed location of this warehouse addition, which if you remember from the previous slide is located towards the very rear of the property, we kind of have these long, skinny properties. You know, staff believe that requiring the applicant to provide those additional openings and doors and requiring them to use the higher quality materials doesn't respond to the sort of existing built environment. And moreover, that, you know, approving the variance and allowing them to add this addition without meeting those standards won't really have any impact to surrounding properties. When it comes to the distance from the property line standard in 195044, this is kind of an odd standard, sort of discussing with staff internally. There's not much of a historic knowledge of why this standard exists. So I did talk with our building staff, and their sort of understanding was that it was really intended to provide some separation for to meet fire standards, but that there are, you know, building code actually has requirements that satisfy those same goals. And so this is a standard that is, yeah, can be met through other means and is actually something that internally we're proposing removing from the code entirely. So yeah, for the purposes of this application, staff don't believe that there are any real impacts to granting this variance because the property owner could very well build the same building on the property line if they so wished. Moving on, in terms of public comments, we only received one comment. That was from Clackamas County Fire District number 1. Those were standard fire comments about access to a public water supply and accessing the property for emergency vehicle purposes. They just commented that the applicant will be required to demonstrate compliance with their standards when they submit for building permits. Staff's recommendation is to approve the requested, sorry, that's a typo, to approve the requested variances and adopt the findings and the conditions of approval. Of course, you have more options than that. You can approve the application with the recommended findings and conditions of approval. Alternatively, you could approve the application with additional modifications to the findings or conditions of approval. Those modifications would need to be read into the record. You could continue the hearing, or you could deny the application. Just to note, the 120-day deadline for this application was waived by the applicant. There was some confusion internally about that specific setback provision and whether a variance was needed for that standard. So we've been working on this one for a little bit now. And any questions? Not seeing any in the room. Any questions on Zoom?
Hey,
Chair Losfeld, we're having a very hard time hearing you. We can practically not hear you at all.
That's why. That's immediately why. Sorry. Question to you all. So wanted to make sure there were no clarifying questions for staff. Commissioner Edge and Commissioner Freeman, you were the two that I maybe didn't see, but assuming you haven't come off mute and that's still the case. Have we received any correspondence on the matter other than those included in the meeting packet?
No.
We have not.
Okay, great. Would the applicant or their representative like to comment? Do we have them available?
They are available, but shaking their head, no comment.
Great job, Ray.
Okay, great.
I do have a question for the applicant, though, just for verification wise, if I may.
Do you need me up here?
Yeah,
Introduce yourselves.
I think that's allowable. Any reason why that wouldn't work out, Laura?
No, it's okay.
Great. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, just state your name and city of residence.
Yeah, Rick Canfield, Estacada, Oregon.
Great. Go ahead, Rick.
And I just want to clarify for everybody here, you are not proposing with to trim any of those trees that are in between the Springwater corridor and the current property line, or removing any of those trees in there?
Not unless we're asked to.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Okay, others? No. Okay, thank you all. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going
all
to
right.
move on then.
Thank you.
Do we have anybody who would like to speak in support of the application?
Not
I'm
seeing.
assuming still no one in the audience.
Correct.
Is that the case? Okay, great. I'm going to move on then. Do we have anybody who wishes to speak in opposition? Okay, thank you. And neutral testimony. Anyone who'd like to speak with neutral testimony? Okay, thank you. Are there any responses to staff, to the testimony from staff? This is a new one in the script. Assuming silence is no further comment.
Yeah, I think that's meant for staff to respond to.
Oh,
Sorry, I did not hear that.
I was
Oh
confused.
yeah, Laura, this is new to the script.
No, we don't have
Do
anything.
you
No
all want
further
to
comment from
comment?
staff.
No, we
No
don't.
comment. Okay. Does the applicant have a rebuttal? Since we didn't hear any testimony, I'm going to move on. Assume that we do not, and then I will close the public testimony portion of this hearing. The public testimony portion of the hearing on the variance for an existing warehouse in Tacoma Station Mixed-Use Zone, file number VR-2022-009 and DEV-2002-003 is now closed. Is the commission ready for discussion?
Yes.
Okay, who would like to lead us off? Commissioner Edge.
Thank you, Chair. it's true that, as proposed, it's not compliant with, the minimum standards in several ways, but it is brought further into compliance. It is brought closer, into compliance. And so, it is doing what the code requires. And so with that in mind, I've reviewed the findings and conditions of approval, and I think the findings that accurately describe the facts in the record, and with the conditions of approval, that it satisfies all of the relevant criteria, and I think that we can approve this tonight.
Thank you, Vice Chair Edge. Are there others at the dais, or Commissioner Freeman, perhaps you have any comments you'd like to add? Hearing none, then I will take a motion.
I'll make a motion to accept VR 2022-009 and DEV 2022-003 for approval.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. I have a motion and it has been seconded. All those in favor of approval, please state aye.
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 Aye. Seeing, I believe unanimous, Commissioner Ernst, just to be sure. Okay, myself included in that. Thank you very much, Commissioners. Application VR-2022-009 and DEV-2002-003 is approved unanimously through this commission. Thank you very much for coming in tonight for the applicant to testify and answer questions. We appreciate that. As always, nice work, staff. Appreciate the report. If anyone wishes to appeal the commission's decision to the city council, you must make application stating the grounds of your appeal within 15 days of the mailing of notice of decision. Please see the planning staff for details. All right, moving us on into the agenda tonight, work session item, draft housing capacity analysis. The work session item is a discussion about the draft housing capacity analysis, which will be introduced by staff. Staff?
Hang on just 1 second. We're getting our consultant on board. I just wanted to,
Hi, Justin. Happy holidays. See you in the new year.
Oh, bye, Justin. Aw.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Likewise.
Before I hand this whole presentation over to Beth for a conversation, I just wanted to let you all know we've been working with the Housing Capacity Technical Committee. Chair Edge has been representing the Planning Commission on that. We've had 4 meetings over the last 6 months or so. So we have kind of gone through all of this information with the HCTC, and we're in kind of the first phase where we're looking at the housing capacity analysis. And that's going to kind of give us a background of our housing need here in Milwaukie. And then there's a second part of it, which is the housing production strategies part of it, which is how are we going to meet that unmet need for housing and what are our strategies to do so? And that's what we'll be coming back to you later. So this is kind of giving you a larger global picture of some demographic information, some things about people who live in the city of Milwaukie and what they're facing regarding housing. And with that, Beth, I think I will just hand it over to you. We've kind of got a little bit of a long presentation, but hopefully we're not just Beth's going to talk at you. We encourage you all to jump in and ask questions. And we hope this is a conversation tonight. And so I will hand it over to you, Beth.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm Beth Goodman with Echo Northwest. I'm your lead consultant on this project. And so as Laura said, we are going to talk through what's essentially your factual basis for estimating your housing need in Milwaukie. So I encourage you, if you have questions, please speak up. Laura, I'm not going to be able to see people in the room with questions because everybody's teensy-tiny at this point.
Got it.
So this project builds on a lot of work that Milwaukie has done over the last several years. So housing affordability has been an important council goal. Your community vision of just a few years ago calls for all residents having affordable housing. You've got your comprehensive plan goals include equity and affordability. And your existing housing affordability strategy, the Milwaukie Housing Affordable Strategy, the MHAS, as we call it, is really all about housing affordability and housing need in Milwaukie. So cities do a housing capacity analysis, which used to be called a housing needs analysis, and a housing production strategy, which is, as Laura said, the follow-on product for this, to answer a number of questions. So how much growth are we expecting over the next 20 years? Do we have buildable land? So land that's vacant and unconstrained that can accommodate this growth? If we don't, what are we going to do about that? What policies are needed to meet Milwaukee's housing needs? So some of those policies might well be regulatory policies to allow and support development of housing, more broadly speaking. And some of those might be programs or actions to support development of housing that's affordable at all income levels. The parts of this project are in dark blue, the housing capacity analysis. That's what you have before you this evening. It's a technical report about things like developable land, characteristics of your residents, your housing market and affordability, and how much growth you're expecting. What we'll be talking about next in the broader project is the housing production strategy. It's essentially equivalent in certain ways to your MHAS, your existing housing affordability strategy. So we'll be looking at things like housing funding options to support actions about housing development and preservation and housing affordability. So those are all the things all above that dotted line. Those are all the parts of this project. Below that dotted line are things like adjustments to the comprehensive plan policy, changes to your zoning code, new housing policies or programs. Those would be changes that would be made after this project is complete. Think about this, especially a housing capacity analysis, as your framework, your foundation of your housing discussions. So we're right in the middle of this project. We've completed 4 meetings with our advisory committee, the HCTC, the housing, oh, I forget what it stands for, honestly. That's our advisory committee. And we've got another 3 meetings with them coming up to discuss issues related to development of that housing production strategy. We've also been doing a certain amount of community engagement, which we'll talk about towards the end of this presentation, and we'll have more community engagement coming up. And then implementing the housing production strategy is essentially going to be continued community engagement as the city is looking at different policies and whether to implement them to support the housing needs that we'll be talking about tonight. Before I go on, are there any questions?
Seeing none from the audience in the room.
Okay. So looking at some information about Milwaukie. Your existing housing stock, about 67% of it is single family detached. That's really similar to the Portland 3-county area overall. 62% of housing in Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas County is single family detached. About a quarter of your housing stock is multifamily, multi-dwelling with 5 or more units. So this is a consideration as we go on and think about new housing types that the city may need. Before we do that, looking at housing tenure, so home ownership rates have stayed really stable, right around 60%, 59% since 2000. When we look at the type of housing that people live in, if they're owners, 96% of that housing is single dwelling detached, which is not really surprising. And then when you look at renters, it's really a mix of multifamily housing, single dwelling detached, as well as various types of plexes, so duplexes, quadplexes, and triplexes, and things like townhouses. So your renter housing stock is a lot more diverse in terms of housing types than your owner housing stock. I see that there is a question.
Yeah, Beth, this is Chair Losfeld. I have a question for you, and I'm sorry, there's some background noise. It's with the data here and the range of dates, was it intentional to leave out kind of the pandemic as an oddity in this data, or is it just simply that we kind of stopped at 2019?
It's a little bit of both. So when we started this project, the 2020 data was not available, and we didn't know what quality that data would be. So that's why we're looking at data from what's called the American Community Survey, the 5-year data for 2015 to 2019. That's the most recently available data at the time when we started this project for a city as small as Milwaukie. So cities smaller than 65,000 people, they get 5-year American Community Survey data.
How accurate do you think that is? Because I've seen 53% of owner-occupied in Milwaukie is a percentage that's been around.
Well, so you're talking about the chart over to this side. I would say it's probably not that far off. I would be surprised if it was 53%, just because I'm looking at what's going on in 2010 and 2000, which are based on decennial census years and have a much larger sample. So it could be a little bit off. If it was 57%, I wouldn't be that surprised. If it was 61%, I wouldn't be that surprised.
But you would be surprised if it was 53%.
Yeah, and 5-year American Community Survey data has a little bit of wobble in it because it's a sample. So, and unfortunately, our 2020 decennial census data is for the nation. It's problematic.
Right.
So we are personally not using that data.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Seeing none in the audience, in the
Thank
room.
you. So then we go on and we look at building permits. And what we see is that for most of the last few years, last decade or so, you've had relatively few units that were permitted. We see an uptick here in fiscal year 2018 and 19 with more multifamily units permitted. And this is not multifamily structures, but individual units of multifamily, multi-dwelling housing. I apologize. And what's not shown here is what was going on in fiscal year 2022, which there was about another 250 units that were multi-dwelling units permitted in 2022. And then we knew that there were about 650 elsewhere in the different stages of development that hadn't been permitted at this point. So in the next couple of years, when you see the next few years of this, you'll see a lot more multi-dwelling unit permitted. This happens in cycles where you have lots of multi-dwelling units permitted 1 year and then a couple of years without any, and then more permitted again. It's the nature of multi-dwelling unit structures. There's a lot of units in one structure, typically speaking. So right now we're seeing about 45% of housing permitted since fiscal year 2010 was multi-dwelling units, and 51% was single detached units and some accessory dwelling units. I think in the next couple of years, you'll see different percentages with a larger share of new housing being multi-dwelling units. And that'll probably subside for a few years after that, and you'll see this cycle. So then switching over to demographic information, looking at your age distribution in Milwaukie, what you see is your larger groups are people 20 to 39 years old and 60 years and older. Both of those groups are larger than the share of population in those age groups in the Portland 3 County region. So the largest increase in number of residents were those aged 20 to 39, and that's since 2010. And people 20 to 39 account for 32% of Milwaukee's population.
I'm sorry, may I ask a question? So if that was from 2010,
That's 2010 to 2019.
Right. Some of those 30-year-olds then may be into that 40 to 59 age range. Am I understanding that maybe correctly?
Well, this data here is 2019 data. And when we look at the change since 2010, that's where you see the largest increase in that younger group.
Sorry. Thank you.
Certainly, I was unclear. So as we think about what may happen in the future, we don't have a forecast by age group for Milwaukie, but when we look at Clackamas counties, what we see is people over 60 years old are forecast to increase the share. So put another way, they're forecast to grow faster than other age groups. And that's also true with the 40 to 59-year-olds. But what you see is slower growth among the people 39 years old and younger. Clackamas County is expected to add about 37 people over age 60 by 2040. So put another way, it's reasonable to expect that Milwaukie will also have somewhat faster growth of seniors, as well as what you were just mentioning, growth in this 40 to 59 age group, as some of these folks here who have stayed in Milwaukie age up to 40 to 59. 59, I apologize. So what I'm saying is growth in older population and less growth in the younger working age population and children. So thinking about household size, on average, Milwaukee's households are smaller than Oregon's households. And that's possibly a result of a larger share of younger people, some of whom probably haven't had children at this point. So 33% of Milwaukee's households are one person and 39% are two person. And that's larger percentages of households in comparison to the Portland 3-county region. It's not all that surprising, but it is worth noting that in general, Milwaukie has more smaller households on average. When you look in the housing capacity analysis report, you'll also see that Milwaukie has a smaller percentage of households with children, with young children at home.
May I ask one question? Do you know how that compares to, let's say, Happy Valley or maybe some of the communities that are around us, Gladstone or?
So I don't have that information at my fingertips. We can easily get that information. And what I'm willing to guess more about Happy Valley is that Happy Valley has got larger household size, probably more households that are 3 people or more, and more households with children under 18. And that is honestly a guess, but I won't be surprised by that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of school district and that kind of stuff. And
Yes. Any other questions? Okay. So then, as we're thinking about future housing need, we've talked about 2 of the important things in considering future housing need. The age of the adults in the household, the household composition. Do you have smaller households or larger households with children, multi-generational households, those kind of questions. And then the largest determinant of the type of housing that people are able to access is household income. And so when we look at Milwaukee's median household income overall at about $62,000 nearly, that's very similar to Oregon's and below Clackamas County's overall median, so overall average of about $80,000. And when you look at the income distribution, what you see is about 60%, nearly 60% of Milwaukee's households have income below $75,000. Compared to about 50% of the 3-county Portland region's households have income below $75,000. So as we start talking next, or in the next few slides, about housing affordability and what households can afford, keep that in mind, that Milwaukee's household income is a little lower than the regional income. Another consideration is growing ethnic and racial diversity. Here we've emphasized ethnic diversity because Latino population are your largest population of color. And so Milwaukee's population of increased from 7% Latino in 2010 to about 9% by 2019. There's about, I think, 1,900 people in Milwaukie who are Latino. And so that does also have implications for future housing need, as Latino households are on average larger household size, more likely to be multi-generational, and more likely to have younger children at home.
I have a quick clarifying question, Beth.
Yes.
You noted earlier the problematic nature of the 2020 census from the Trump administration. If those figures were used, do you know what it would even say on a slide like this? I haven't heard much about the problems. I mean, I've heard a lot about the problems of the 2020 census, but I don't know how they manifest in data like this.
So it's hard to say. First of all, the 2020 census, the decennial census, they've only put out a limited number of census tables. So that's data points from the census. And so some of this data isn't even really available or isn't available at the geographies we're used to it being available. Then you've got the American Community Survey, which happens every year. It's a sample, a 2 or 3% sample across the nation of all households. So any of us could receive an American Community Survey questionnaire any given year. I know I have sometime in the last few years because I was very happy to fill it out. I was very excited. So that data, the 5-year American Community Survey data, the 2020 part of it, that's only 1 year of 5. And we're going to have to live with that 1 year for the next 5 years because it'll continue to be in the sample. So would it say something a lot different than this? Probably not, because you've got the other 4 years in there that are pretty good. And the other thing to realize is that ACS data does, it's got a little jiggle in it as it goes along. And so what I mean by that is it is a sample. Things change by 1%. Sometimes things will change by more than 1% on some types of figures. But if you look at sort of the overall trend of where things are going, that's how I decide whether or not it's more trustworthy. And also we pay attention a lot to how much we're breaking up the data. So if you ask a question about, I'm just going to skip back here for a moment to this. So how many people are owners or renters? That's only breaking up the data into 2 buckets, owners and renters. That's that's more trustworthy data. It's less likely to have margins of error that are kind of high. When you look at the slide on this side, that's breaking up the data into 2 buckets and 4 more pieces within each of those buckets. So that's disaggregating the data quite a lot. So how much do I trust, say, this 54% of households that are renters? Do I think it's definitely 54%, or is it probably 50%, maybe 58%, somewhere around there? That's how I think of it. I'm pretty confident that I see a pattern that I recognize from a lot of other cities. So if this was showing that most owner-occupied housing was multifamily, or a really big chunk of it was multifamily, I would be looking at that data pretty closely and saying that does not seem right. Milwaukie is not downtown Portland. You don't have condos in the same way. So some of this is understanding that the data is flawed, but knowing enough to be able to look for flaws that really look like flaws. And that's some of the reason that we look at data further back, in addition to seeing if we're seeing a real change or the data, homeownership seems pretty stable in Milwaukie over a long period of time. Does that help with the question?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thanks for the primer. Appreciate it.
Oh, certainly. And the other thing we do is as we're talking to people about what we're seeing in the data, we're also validating it. Does that sound right? Does that sound off? We'll get up to a slide in a few minutes that I'll talk about margins of error a little bit more and what certainty I think there is in the data. Are there any other questions before we go on? No. Okay. Let me just do a time check. All right, we're going along well. So then one of the things that you consider in a housing needs analysis is, well, what about where people live and work? So what we see is that you've got about 15,000 jobs in Milwaukie, and only 752 people, approximately, both live in Milwaukie and work at jobs that are located in Milwaukie. So that's about 5%. Most of the people commute into Milwaukie from someplace else, commonly Portland, Gresham, other areas around. I'm sure there are some people who live in unincorporated parts of Clackamas or Washington County. The question that's often asked is, how do we ensure that there are more opportunities for housing for people to live and work in our community? And that is, I think, a worthwhile goal and worthwhile to think about and look at. But then you also have to look at the fact that Milwaukie is a smaller city in a big region. When you're in a region as big as the Portland region, people are going to commute quite a bit. There's really not going to be a way to necessarily stop that. And I'm not sure that it would be wise to stop it, because businesses in Milwaukie have access to labor from across the Portland region. That's an important consideration. Then you have opportunities for things like transit and those kind of things to address some of the transportation challenges, which are certainly important. So looking at median sales price data, this is the best available data when we started the project from the end of 2021. We were looking at median sales prices of about $525,000. And the important thing is here, one of the important things is where this lines up in communities that are relatively nearby. And you'll notice that we didn't include Portland in this because Portland's a very different community than many of the communities we've got here. But Milwaukie is more affordable than any other community other than Gladstone here. And you see your Lake Oswego's and your Westlands and your Happy Valleys of the world are quite a bit more expensive than Milwaukie. But also consider that the median sales price in Milwaukie increased by nearly 200% since 2012. This is consistent with what's been happening across the region, where we're just seeing a great deal of housing price increases. We've seen that slow in recent months. And of course, the change in interest rates is really affecting the kind of housing that people can buy and that they can afford, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So then rental costs. This is based on data from a company that does surveys of rental costs across the Portland region and in Milwaukie specifically, called CoStar. And what we're seeing is that the average asking rent in 2021 was about $1,339. That didn't include basic utility costs, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But what we can tell is that since 2011, rent increased by 31%. So we see since 2012, sales prices increasing by almost 200%, rent increasing by 31%. And we've got a table in the housing capacity analysis that shows the change in incomes, in household incomes. And what we see is that the change in incomes was very, very minor. It was a couple of percentage point increases. So the points here are that rent is increasing faster than incomes, and housing prices are increasing massively faster than incomes.
Beth, may I ask a question? And probably historically, there isn't a lot of data except maybe from 45 to 55, or maybe from 2000 to 2007, where you saw such a dramatic increase in house pricing. But relative to the rate of increase in rental, that seems relatively minor to what the house price has gone on. Is that typical or regionally wise? Did the other rates go up a lot higher, or how do you analyze or put those two pieces together?
So this increase in rents of about 31%, it's similar to what we're seeing across a lot of the Portland region. So an increase in rent, and not a corresponding increase in incomes. And it used to be, the 90s seem like the dark ages now, but it used to be, back in the 1990s and the early 2000s, rent and incomes grew at about the same rate. And after this last housing market crash back in 2008, 9, 10, rent rates started increasing faster than incomes. And that's a particular problem because people have the, if you can rent, then the fact that you can't own doesn't mean that you have no place to live. But if you can't rent, then that's fundamentally a very different problem in a lot of ways. So it used to be that rents and incomes increased at about the same rate. And what we've been seeing since the mid 2010s is rents increasing faster than incomes. And so I think that's a big part of what we're seeing in some of our housing crisis at this point. Commissioner Edge.
Thanks, Beth. So on that note, thinking back to how this worked back in the 1990s, where things kind of moved more in lockstep. Are you able to recall, offhand, what say the average vacancy rate was, through, in renter house or, in rental units during the 1990s versus the last decade? And do you think that because it feels like since we emerged from the Great Recession, and kind of got things back to normal, that our vacancy rates have been very low. Very, 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 very low. Some of the lowest in the nation for several years. And so I'm wondering if that lack of capacity has some impact on the fact that our prices are growing faster than incomes, faster than the ability of people to actually pay that rent.
So I can answer your question halfway. I don't remember what rent vacancy rates were back in the 90s. That was actually before my time of being a planner. But what I can tell you, a healthy vacancy rate is about for rental housing about 5 to 7%. At this point, what we're seeing. From the spring 2020, the apartment report, which is a report that is done across the Portland region and actually calls around to different rental places. And I would say that's a particularly good source of information. The vacancy rate was about 2.7% in Milwaukie compared to the broader region, the Portland region's vacancy rate of about 3.6%. So if a healthy vacancy rate is in the 5 to 7%, and what we're seeing is in the 2 to 3%, maybe 3.5%, then we're seeing an unhealthy vacancy rate. And what that's indicative of is, what the problem is that there's not enough housing to essentially lubricate the market so that I can move from apartment A to apartment B. And instead, I am trying to move from apartment A and I'm really scrounging around to find apartment B. And I think I would attribute that to what we call underproduction. So since the Great Recession, what we've seen is a whole lot less development of housing. And for quite a while in that, we saw a whole lot less development of multifamily housing. So the sort of surge that we're seeing in multifamily housing, and it manifests itself a little bit different in different communities across the Portland region. The surge we're seeing is partially in response to the fact that we underproduce that kind of housing. And now we're struggling to produce enough of that housing to keep up, much less catch up. And so if you want to know more about that kind of thing, you might check out the reports for Up for Growth. Up for Growth is documented that a lot more detail.
Do you know if apartments are required to report their unoccupied units? Like, is there any requirement? Is there an official?
No, when the census is doing surveys of vacancy, they do it in a different way where they essentially have people going around and knocking on doors, and they're doing a vacancy survey all across the year. Someplace like the apartment report is going to actually call up and ask different places what their vacancy rates are. And that's what a source like CoStar does also.
There's no legislation requiring owners of apartment buildings or
no
landlords to report?
No, there's no central place that would take the reporting.
Huh.
So
I'll just chime in too. I'm sure this might be part of your report, but Oregon was the #1 state for several years or a couple of years, #1, #2, #3 of people moving from outside the state into the state. I think that was like 2017. Does anybody remember that? I think that also contributed. That might be part of your.
Certainly.
Yeah, of the reason that we're at maybe 2% of vacancy.
Well, Oregon is no doubt an attractive place for people to move to. About 2/3 of the growth in Oregon over the last several decades is the result of people moving from some other state into Oregon. So it's in migration. So that really drives our growth here in Oregon. Whereas if you look at a place like Utah, their growth is really driven by natural increase. So more births than deaths.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a smaller driver of our growth here in Oregon. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So then I'm going to go and talk some, if I can click right, about affordability. So when we think about affordability, we're thinking about it in a range of income range. So in the Portland region, this is 2021 data, I believe. The median family income was $96,900. And so that's for a household of 4. If you imagine a household of 2, for instance, their median family income will be lower than that. And a household of 6, their median family household income would be higher than that. This is a HUD construct, the idea of median family income. What it allows us to do, and what we'll do in a few moments, is look at different housing needs at different income levels and the certainly attainable rents, and then the potentially attainable housing sales prices. So a household that earns $96,900 could afford about $2,420 a month in rent. And before we had interest rates increase so much, they could afford about $340,000 to $390,000 in home sales price. It's lower than that right now with interest rates so high, but we need to think about this as a long-range plan. At some point, interest rates are undoubtedly going to come back down, maybe not as low as they were for as long as they were, because that was unusual. But households will be able to afford to buy more because they'll be paying less for interest. So when you think about newly developing housing, Newly developing housing, a lot of the time is affordable to households with income above average. So here we've got 120% of median family income, about $116,000. A lot of our newly developed housing is affordable only at that income range and well above that. So then when we look at housing that's affordable for lower income households, so say at 50% of median family income, nearly $50,000 a month, $50,000 a year in income, that household can afford about $1,200 a month in rent. Well, we talked about the average monthly rent in Milwaukie being about $1,300. If you add about $250 a month for utilities, that comes to nearly $1,600. And why did I add utilities? Because as we're thinking about affordability, it's housing costs plus some basic utilities like electricity and heat. So that household with income at 50% of MFI certainly can't afford $1,600 a month in rent. Housing that's affordable at these lower income ranges is typically developed by, it's developed as income restricted housing. So it's developed by your nonprofits, by your housing authority. It has money in it from, say, state and federal sources. If you're familiar with the concept of low-income housing tax credits, that is a common source of funding to support development of that. But your average market rate developer, your average for-profit developer, they're not developing housing that's affordable in this income range. And this concept is important as we're going on here. And so housing that's affordable between 50 or 60% of median family income, up to 80, sometimes 100% of median family income, that's oftentimes multi-dwelling unit type housing. And it is less frequently developed because it's not financially feasible for a developer to develop that and obtain the rents that could be obtained and still make a profit. So it's just not profitable to develop that kind of housing. And we'll return to that concept in a few minutes. When you look at your median sales price of $500,000, basically it's going to take a household income of $135,000 to $190,000 to afford that. That's 100 to 195% of median family income. Again, your mortgage loan rates require higher income levels at this point for affording this kind of housing. And you have to have income of about 65% of median family income, or about $63,000 to afford the average monthly rent. And that rent is lower than newly built housing's rent would be. So newly built housing has more expensive rents. So applying this sum to Milwaukie, and I'll come back and answer questions in just one moment.
Thanks.
Hey, oh, sorry.
No, yeah, please continue and we can come back in a moment.
So the important thing here is to see that you've got nearly 40% of your households have income below $48,000 or below 50% of median family income. What they can afford is essentially income restricted housing, what they can afford that's newly built. They probably can afford some housing that's out there that is just very low cost. It's also probably got some quality issues with it. When you look at this upper income group, that's what a lot of new housing is built for. 19% of your housing, your households, about 1,628 households have income that begins to be able to afford the median sales price. And then about 43% of your households are sort of in the middle with middle income housing. Some people call that workforce housing, but really everything below 120% of median family income, it's all workforce housing. So I would like to answer your question.
Thanks, Beth. And maybe going back a slide, had a comment and a question, looking at this slide and and looking at the far right end of this in terms of 120% of MFI, and also looking in the upper right-hand corner in terms of median home sale price. Just think it's worth noting for the commission that, the new construction that's occurring in our city, thinking about some developments near my home off of 32nd and Roswell, as well as Cheragino Farms. I think all of these units are selling for well over $700,000. So while the medium home sale price for the entire city might be lower than that, in terms of new construction, we're looking definitely at much higher levels. And I think that leads to my question in recognizing we're not working on policy, we're working on like the factual basis for this. But just had a question either for Beth or for staff in terms of whether or not the construction excise tax also applies to single dwelling development. I know it applies on multi-family, but I'm unclear if it applies at the single dwelling level.
I don't think it does, but I'm not 100% sure. Beth, do you know the answer to that question?
I think the question is the construction excise tax taxed on, so single dwelling units, are they taxed with the construction excise tax?
Correct. Yeah, that's the question.
And I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I think it's a no, but I can confirm.
Yeah. Might just be something to try and confirm as we move forward thinking about policy making at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, Beth, in this chart, and I'm not nitpicking it or trying to demean it, but there were, let's say, a lot of people who were making the 48.5 at the time when the median household income in the city was 180,000 and haven't left, right? Does that get reconciled in this chart, or is that only for new, or is this only looking at new people coming in?
What is that 185 that you're referring to? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. 25 years ago when I moved into this town, right, I bought my house for $150,000 and I was making the 48,500, the 50% of the MFI, right?
Yes.
And if I chose to stay in that house, and I still make my 48.5, I'm certainly much
Yes.
better off than anybody else is on that chart as a newcomer. So is this based on newcomer, or does anybody take into consideration what housing stock is paid off for, or what we're looking at as affordability that way to the current residents of Milwaukie, or is this for future residents?
So are you seeing a document here?
Yes.
Yes.
You know, with a really geeky chart in it that honestly is kind of hard to understand. So the chart that you're looking at is before the house chart. That's a conceptual chart. This actually looks at data that is about households in Milwaukie, saying if the unit is affordable to a household earning with income of 50% or less of MFI, how many households who have that income are living there. So this is basically saying there's, congruency between household income and the level of unit affordability. Where you're talking about is households with higher income that are affordable technically to lower income households. They're renting or buying down. So like technically I bought my house in 1999 and it was, $150,000. Technically at this point I'm renting or buying down because I live in a house that is a whole lot less than I can technically afford.
Okay.
I could afford a lot more house if I chose to. And so there is a place in the housing capacity analysis where we recognize that. We're not making a normative judgment about that. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It is simply a fact that some households live in housing that is that they could afford more housing if they chose to. And I would assume that this kind of trend will continue somewhat. But as we're looking at households that are newly moving into Milwaukie, this is more of the reality that they're living in now and in the future. But 20 years from when they bought their house, maybe their house will be comparatively affordable to what they could afford.
I mean, you might have already said this, but is the household earns, is that before taxes or after? Because I'm just looking
This is
at the rent.
before,
Okay.
before taxes. So I don't think I've gone through the concept of cost burden, which I'll do in just a slide or two. But essentially, we're making the assumption that the amount of housing that you can afford is 30% or less of your gross income, so income before taxes, and that's a HUD standard. Is it a reasonable standard? I suspect for some households it's a harder standard.
I mean, if a household, 2 people, maybe with kids at 96,000, 2,400 a month rent just still seems like a lot to me. But I don't know.
It does.
Like, I don't, that's a tight budget, it seems like. And that's
It is a tight
good.
budget.
That's an affordable, that's crazy.
That's the edge of affordable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. So shall I go on, or do you want to talk more about this one?
No, please, yeah, continue.
Okay. We got a fair bit more to get through. So here's the concept of if you're building new housing, a household that has income below 60% of median family income, the housing that's going to be affordable to them, that's newly built, is going to be income restricted, subsidized affordable housing in general. Where you've got between 60% and 120% of median family income, that's your middle income affordable housing. That's your, workforce housing, if you want to use that term. And then we just use the term market rate affordability. So people in the 120% and above, they can afford most, not necessarily all, most multi-dwelling housing in most communities. And they begin to be able to afford the average sales price. And not all of these households can afford that. But that's the concept we're using, and we'll be using more as we're talking about policy and the housing production strategy. So then looking at affordability, I probably should have done this set of slides a little earlier, but it's okay. So looking at the concept of cost burden. So a household is said to be cost burden if they're spending 30% or more of their income on housing costs, and that's gross income, so income before taxes. And housing costs are things like rent and basic utilities like electricity and heat. Or if you're a homeowner, it's things like, mortgage, those basic utilities, interest on your loans, as well as insurance. So it's all of those things for household homeowners bundled together. A household is said to be severely cost burdened if they're spending 50% or more of their income on housing costs. And so what we see is about 40% of your households in Milwaukie are cost burdened. Gladstone has a higher share of cost burden. And you might look down this list and say, hey, why does Happy Valley have so little cost burden, or Lake Oswego? And I would say the answer is that households that are moderate and lower income can't even begin to get into Happy Valley or Lake Oswego, whereas Milwaukie is comparatively more affordable. So you have a little higher rates of cost burden. I wouldn't look at this as a judgment on the city. It's bad that you've got high rates of cost burden. There's a lot of ways in which it actually indicates that your housing market is more accessible.
Do you add in things like the necessary choices that we have to have in life? Like, for example, cable. I know I'm old. I do cable. Or cell phone bills or that kind of stuff?
No, none of that's added in. This is a national standard. So is it exactly the right standard? Maybe not, but at least it's comparable. And at least it's a standard that can be used across the nation.
Does this also correlate with the owner occupied rate? So if we looked at Lake Oswego and Happy Valley, would we see comparable differences in the percentages?
So what you would see, this is cost burden by owner and renter. What I've seen in almost every city I've worked in is that cost burden is less common among owners. It's a lot more common among renters. I would see that in Happy Valley and Lake Oswego.
Would you know what the owner occupied rate is for, I know there was a slide, you don't have to go back to it, but of Lake Oswego?
No, I don't have that information for Lake Oswego right here.
I mean, it's also going to be less common with owners because financial institutions have standards for who they lend to and how much they lend. So a renter doesn't necessarily have any financial oversight like that. It's just between them and their landlord in terms of the rents they're willing to bear.
It's also equity and wealth built.
Yeah.
Right.
And generational.
Yeah. Right. Well, and the question that we had asked, how many people are, and I forget the term that you used, under housed or, right, they bought at a lower
buying
price.
or renting down.
Right,
Yes.
right, renting down. So you would assume that your owners, if they've lived in the city for 5 years, right, would be in much better shape than renters who typically are not long-term residents just by the nature of a renter market, right?
Maybe not long-term in the same unit, maybe long-term in the community though.
Right.
And this doesn't account for accumulated wealth, and it doesn't account for debts. So this is by no means perfect. So a person can have high accumulated debts, and that doesn't show up here, or they could have a lot of wealth and little income, and that doesn't show up here. What we typically see, and as we go on and talk about a little bit more data, there's not too many owners, I think, especially in a place like Milwaukie, which isn't a place like Ashland or Hood River, where you're attracting, more retirees from California, for instance, who have a lot more accumulated wealth. What we see is that it's usually a pretty small percent of the population that might be in that position, where they have potentially accumulated wealth and they're showing up as cost burden because they have low income. So it does happen, but not all that common. So I think what the takeaway from here is that, half of your renters, a little more than half, are cost burdened, and 26% of them are severely cost burdened. I would think of these renters as being in a lot of trouble. We've got other tables that show the different rates of cost burden by income levels for renter households and owner households. I'm not trying to present all of that information, but that information is available to us. So then this tells us something about housing need by income level. But of course, you've got housing need that differs for different groups of people. So I'm going to talk here for a moment about people experiencing houselessness, housing need that's different for people of color, for people over 65 years old, and for people with disabilities. In all of these cases, these are groups of people that are disproportionately cost burdened. So they have higher rates of cost burden than the overall average. I think I'll say all of them, they also have lower average incomes. And so the housing needs are really different for these different groups. So first we'll talk about people experiencing houselessness. What we've got here is some information about houseless estimates in Clackamas County, say in 2022. Where we're looking at an estimate of about 550 people, 560 people who were identified as experiencing homelessness in the county in 2022. We know that these numbers are typically underestimates. The point in time count happens once a year. And of course, you don't get everybody in it. It's an underestimate. It's probably about twice as much as we're seeing in the point in time count. And we've also got data from the school districts about students experiencing houselessness. And so that's in the report as well. So people experiencing houselessness We don't know a lot because good data isn't collected about their incomes, but what we do know is that nearly 90% have incomes below 30% of median family income, and this is across the whole state. And people experiencing houselessness, almost by definition, are unable to afford market rate housing costs. The unique housing needs really vary by reason for houselessness, but they can range from needing emergency assistance like rent support, needing permanent supportive housing, so that's housing that addresses reasons for houselessness and provides services to people who are houseless, and then access to an affordable unit. Some people just need that housing that they can afford and they don't need additional services. So the reason that we're talking about these different groups in part is to understand their unmet housing needs, and in part so that as we're going into the policy discussion and the housing production strategy, we can talk about different ways to address those needs. And Milwaukee's already doing a fair bit, especially compared to other communities. So people experiencing houselessness have unique needs. Looking at people of color, this is information about household income by race and ethnicity. And what I'll deconstruct this a little bit for you. So overall, when we look at the median household income in Milwaukie, remember, it was somewhere around $60,000. In Clackamas County, it was around $80,000. And where you see these little black eyes, they're whiskers, those indicate margins of error. So overall for Clackamas County, the margin of error is really, really small. It's because we've got a big sample. We know a lot. There's a lot of respondents for Clackamas County. It's a little bit bigger for Milwaukie, and so that means it might be something more like $57,000, or it might be $64,000. But it's a pretty tight little margin of error. But that's because it's for all people in the community. When you look at Latino, which is your largest community of color, what we see is that there's a larger margin of error, but just about in any case, even the top margin of error is below the average from Milwaukie. And when we look at the actual average, it's somewhere around $50,000. That's considerably below average. And so Latino households are pressed harder with affordability. And they have fewer options for housing that is affordable without being cost burdened. And that's part of why you see higher rates of cost burden. So what are the unique housing needs for people of color? So it's for housing, access to housing that's affordable. It's for access to housing without discrimination. We know that discrimination still goes on in our housing markets. It's for access for housing that meets the needs of their household. So does the household of color have a multi-generational household? Maybe they're a household, say, of 5 or 6 people, some children and say 3 adults. Well, that's going to be different than the needs of a household of 2 people and say 2 adults. So those things are unique. And there's more things that are unique. So cost burden, again, is higher in general, especially for severe cost burden for people of color. So looking at people age 65 and older, more than half of them have income of below $50,000. That happens to be about where your 50% of median family income is. And so this is why I say that a lot of your older households really are in some trouble in finding affordable housing. You don't have too many households with fairly high income. And so they're also going to need access to housing that's affordable, access to housing without discrimination. And I'm going to hop over here because I'm going to conflate these two groups just a little bit. Access to housing that's physically appropriate for them, physically accessible. So if they have a disability, like an ambulatory disability, do they have access to housing that, say, has a ramp and has wider doors so their wheelchair can fit through? And so nearly 17% of Milwaukee's population has one or more disabilities, and you can see the common ones here. Most commonly, let's see, independent living difficulty and ambulatory difficulty. So like people age 65 years and older, they need housing that's affordable, without discrimination, and meets their unique needs. And of course, not all seniors have a disability, and certainly not all people with disabilities are seniors. There's just a fair bit of overlap. So that is your basic information about your housing needs. I'm only laughing because I feel like I've talked forever and ever and ever. This next part's a little shorter. Okay, so you remember we go back to what are we trying to accomplish? Well, we're trying to understand what the need is, that's the demand side, and what's the supply, how much housing could we accommodate over the next 20 years? We're looking at housing, where you could build housing in 3 different categories. You've got your vacant land. Not a surprise that Milwaukie doesn't have a lot of vacant land. With that, we look at historical densities. So what densities will Milwaukie be developing over the next 20 years? And then we've got a couple of analyses about infill and redevelopment potential. And so I'm just going to walk through these things, and I'm going to try to walk through them a little bit faster. Some of them are easier than others, but you'll stop me when you have questions. So this is a map of your vacant buildable land in Milwaukie. It doesn't include land that is constrained, say, by floodplains. I don't think we've got any steep slopes in here, but things that are physical constraints like floodplains aren't included. And so what we see is that about 30 acres of your moderate density land is vacant, and that's going to be mostly R-MD. You've got about 12 acres of land that is high density that is vacant. You don't have a lot of that. And then in your commercial mixed use areas, you've got about 10 acres of land that is vacant. So we'll come back to this in a few minutes, but the takeaway here is not surprising to anybody. Most of your land in Milwaukie is developed. Okay. So then you might say to yourself, but hey, didn't we just do stuff for missing middle housing, House Bill 2001? How does that fit in? So what we did is we did an analysis to look at infill development as well as redevelopment potential from House Bill 2001, allowing things like cottage housing, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses. And those are the ones that I can remember off the top of my head, on a lot of your lands. What we found in this is mostly the opportunities are for infill, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. Here's all your land that is zoned RMD, and that is on parcels larger than 3,000 square feet with no more than 2 units developed before 2020. So this is your land where you don't have constraints. And here in this little overlay, you can see some of where you have constraints. Those parcels aren't necessarily counted. We've looked at it by tax lot sizes. So everything that has from the cream color on up to the brown color, those are larger tax lots. So we started with all of this land. How much infill or redevelopment might you reasonably expect from middle income housing? So we started with the understanding that not all potentially viable sites will be further developed. So we started with the concept of how much zone capacity is out there. And the answer is there's quite a bit of zone capacity that's out there. And then we filtered it down through what sites are viable for infill or redevelopment. And so that was looking at the size of your sites and your values, where really expensive housing, especially on smaller sites, has less viability for infill than, say, a less expensive existing dwelling on a large site. So if you have an existing house on a 20,000 square foot site. That's different than if you have an expensive house on a 5,000 square foot site. So then we looked at issues of how frequently do you see properties for sale like this? The fact that not all owners are going to be interested in this. And then thinking about market timing and site-specific factors. And basically filtered down to the idea of this is a subset of your RMD lots that are more likely potentially to have infill and redevelopment. So what we did in this, and there's many pages of this, is we looked at first, you've got about 5,795 parcels, so tax lots that have infill or redevelopment that are allowed by zoning. So when we filtered down through making sure that we've got reasonable sizes of parcels and value criteria. So in other words, we're looking at parcels with housing that is not the most expensive of the housing and parcels that are reasonable size. You've got about 3,800 parcels in that range. As we filtered it down further, we identified about 1,256 parcels where you have more likelihood over the next 20 years of seeing infill or redevelopment. And so we looked at parcels that are funny shapes or have the house just in the wrong place for a further subdivision, that kind of thing, and filtered those out. And so sort of in a poof of magic, we estimated that there was about between 600 and 1,600 units of likely infill mostly, maybe a little bit of redevelopment over the next 20 years. We tried to triangulate this because there's no clear answer. So we looked at this in a few different ways of looking at how much had we seen happening in Milwaukie over a small period of time. What were we seeing in some of the other areas of the region in terms of types of conversion of uses and different development types, that kind of thing. And that's how we came to about 600 to 1,600 units of missing middle housing types are likely to redevelop, really infill develop over the next 20 years. Does anybody have questions about that? There's quite a lot of it in the housing capacity analysis.
I know.
I have a question, just kind of generally. It's like the redevelopment we're talking about in the infill. Are we thinking there's like homeowners who are doing this redevelopment, or is it like developers coming in? Who are we hypothesizing are doing this work?
Well, first of all, you're not talking about much redevelopment here. Most of this is infill, where you have an existing lot and it would subdivide, and it would be the owner of the lot choosing to do it. So if you imagine that you have a lot that is, say, 20,000 square feet, and let's just imagine that it has a house valued $350,000. Would an owner choose to subdivide their lot, but keep their existing house, or might they choose to remove that house and subdivide the whole thing a little more efficiently and build missing middle housing there? And of course, they'd be working with the developer to do that. So those are two different types of options. Does that answer your question?
Kind of. I'm just kind of thinking about like the funding. So if I own my house and I've got like a really big lot, but that doesn't necessarily mean I have a couple extra $100,000 to build on it. No, you'd have to be working with somebody who has the money to build on it, and they'd probably be buying the land from you. And so that goes into the fact that a lot of lots are tricky to do this on. That's why you're not seeing a humongous gob of it. Yeah, so I was just thinking, I was like, we might, the land might be there. I just wondering like where the funding is going to come from to do the infill. Yeah, I think where the funding comes from for most development, I think what we're going to see is it'll be a little slow going at first. And then maybe in 5 or 10 years, more developers will have gotten used to doing this in the region, and maybe doing a little bit in the outer years.
So I have a question about the magic between the 600 and 1,600 units.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, is something as simple as 600 being, taking the available parcels and saying that at 600 you're putting something simple like a single ADU, and 1,600 saying, well, you're going to go all in and maybe you'll even take out the existing structure and put in like a quadplex. Is it that simple, or is it more magic to it?
There's more magic to it.
All right.
So I wasn't going to dig into this unless we had questions.
But
so
you got one.
that is fine. That's why I have this here. And realize that I didn't actually do this part of the analysis. So if you have questions I can't answer, we can get them answered for you. So the 600 comes from looking at what happened in Portland since the mid-90s. So what share of corner lots in Portland where they allowed duplexes for 20 or more years have converted? How might this compare with Milwaukie? And the estimate ended up resulting in about 600 net new units could be produced. That seems like a low estimate to us, but it's also believably low. It's in the, it passes what I call the red face test. While looking at the other two shares, so number 2 is share of viable properties converted based on recent Milwaukie infill. And the problem with this approach is that it's only based on like 2 years of data. And so that's a really short period of time. How will it shape up, once we have 5 years of data? I can't really take a guess, but based on this, we'd be looking at about 1,200 new units of infill based on what has happened in recent years in Milwaukie. And then the first estimate looks at a neighborhood that is similar to Milwaukie, I think in Southeast Portland, honestly, where you've been allowed to do this kind of conversion for longer. And so if the market in that part of Southeast Portland is similar to the market in Milwaukie, and my housing real estate analyst thinks that it is, then if we apply the kind of conversions, the kind of development patterns that we saw there, that's where you get to about the 1,600 estimate. So we're trying to triangulate, look at this from a number of different perspectives in a lack of good enough data.
Thanks for sharing kind of how the black box works a little bit. Appreciate that. And I think one thing for folks maybe just to think about is, that third scenario or third, maybe most conservative forecast, the 20-year time horizon for looking back will take into account macroeconomic factors like interest rate variation, which, right now interest rates are wild. So trying to understand that first and second scenario that might not take that into account as much is just, I think, worth flagging.
That's certainly possible. And we'll tell you why this matters and how much it matters in a few minutes.
So I would just like to share some good news. Maybe a Patrick Mahomes stone throw away from each other in the Linwood neighborhood, but they're pretty close. There are proposed 108 affordable or workforce housing that is in at least pre-application right now. So yeah, we're getting close to that 600 number, if that's what we're shooting for, if those pass, I guess. And those are, one is a tear down of a house and with a large lot in the back. The other one is an old farm that's never ever really been developed, and it would be considered infill because the house in front of it owned it, but the house is going to stay.
Yep. And that's what you'll see a lot of those kind of things, I think.
Do you have
Are there any?
Sorry. Yes, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Do you have any data on how this is going to affect the population density? Like right now, I think we're at like 4,700 something per square mile.
Well, we're not talking about, in the end, a lot more units and a lot more households compared to, a lot more people compared to what you already have. So it will increase it some, but it's, I don't think over this, certainly in this next 6-year period, I don't think it's going to fundamentally reshape Milwaukie in any way. Over the 20-year period, might it have more effect? It could. It really depends on how much uptake there is in this kind of development. And I mentioned a 6-year period because the city is required to reconsider these issues, do this analysis again, not this particular one, but the housing capacity analysis again with newer, better data every 6 years. Are there any other questions? Then I'm going to walk on to the next. So that was about land that's in RMD, which you have a lot of. What about redevelopment potential? And this is a lot more about redevelopment potential in mixed use areas. So what we did here is essentially staff identified potential mixed use sites where redevelopment may occur based on what the property owners or developers' interests are. So these are things that are in the pipeline in purple, like Hillside Manor or, boy, I don't know how to pronounce that, Henley Place, or things that we've heard rumblings of. So potential for new development. And a few of these things you'll notice are on vacant land. And so we didn't want to double count. So we've, in our estimate here of about 1,388 new dwelling units, that doesn't include things that might go on vacant land. It's a little more when you include the things that might go on vacant land, because again, we'll come back to an estimate of capacity for your vacant land if they don't want to double count.
These rental?
I'm sorry?
Did you say rental units?
No.
I would ask Laura a little more about these. I think some of these are rental and some of them are probably elsewise.
The things that are in the pipeline are probably are rental, but some of the things that haven't developed, we don't know if they would do condos, but we have no idea if that would happen. And it's probably somewhat unlikely. There would primarily be rentals.
Maybe a follow-up question for staff. Looking at the Murphy site, I noticed that half the site does not have potential cross hatches on it, and I was just curious about that. Right there.
Doesn't have potential cross hatches on it.
So in other words, there's a piece of the site that's not showing as potential. I don't know if this was intentionally left vacant. Or it's probably about the specific proposal for that site.
We don't have to get into it now. It caught my eye when I was reviewing the materials.
I have to double check that.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions about this? All right, so I'm gonna go put all of this together. So I mentioned a little while ago that we had about 30 acres of moderate density, 12 acres of high density, and 10 acres of commercial mixed use that were vacant. When we look at the recent densities, the historical development densities, and essentially do multiplication, what we see is new capacity on moderate density on vacant, unconstrained land. It's about 148 dwelling units. High density is about 92, and it's because you don't have a whole lot of land that's high density, that's vacant, and your recent development densities and high density have been relatively low. And then mixed use, you're seeing relatively high densities in your mixed use areas. So we're talking about 970 dwelling units of capacity on your vacant land. And your middle income, your middle housing types between 600 and 1,600. And then your mixed use redevelopment, about 1,388. So the numbers that we just talked about. So when we add that together, Your low and your high are representing what we just saw there. So that's 600 of the infill and redevelopment, and here we're up to 1,600 of that infill and redevelopment plus the vacant land. When we looked at your forecast, which we haven't talked much about your forecast, we haven't talked at all about your forecast. Let me step back and talk about your forecast for new housing. Metro estimates that about 1,670 new households, new dwelling units will grow in Milwaukie over the next 20 years. We've allocated those out to different plan designations, your moderate, your high density, and your commercial mixed use, based partially on what we saw historically and partially on the types of housing that you need. So a fair bit of your housing need is for multi-dwelling unit housing, as well as your plexes and townhomes, your middle housing types. And so where those were allowed, we allocated those housing types down. And what we see in the end is that for moderate density, at the low end, you might have a deficit of 221 units. At the high end, you might have a surplus. As I said, I suspect that 600 units of capacity for your infill, for your middle housing types, that's probably low. I also suspect the 1,600 might be too high. So the way I look at your moderate density is you're probably okay there. You probably don't have a problem. I'm going to skip to commercial mixed use. What we're seeing is an awful lot of development potential in downtown. So you have a surplus in commercial mixed use of about 1,800 units. Your high density areas, as I said, there's not much land that's vacant and they're underperforming in terms of density. So any way you look at it, you've probably got a deficit there. And so this starts to pose some policy questions. So your moderate density, you've just made some pretty big zoning changes that'll take a few years to see what starts happening as a result of House Bill 2001. You're probably close enough to balance at this point. You may have a small surplus there. Only time's going to tell. Your high density, you don't have much land in there. You're not seeing development densities that are what I would consider high density for a city like Milwaukie. It's like 7.5 dwelling units an acre, just very low density for high density. You're usually looking more at, say, 20 dwelling units an acre or something like that. So, you know, there's I think an important question of why are your development densities so low and your high density? And should you do something about that? Should you change your policies to support things that are more like, you know, 3-story apartment buildings, essentially, or higher, if that's what you chose? Should you consider rezoning land for high density once you understand why it's underperforming? Don't rezone land before you've fixed the underperformance issue. And your commercial mixed use is where we're talking about in downtown and such. Is this the preferred location for a lot of multi-unit housing? And I think that's a policy question. So that's where we get to at the end of the housing capacity analysis, where we've got some conclusions. We've got a lot of information to consider in the housing production strategy.
So
are there questions?
Yeah, a question and comment. So one of my biggest, I think, frustrations in the research that I've done over the last several years in this specific area is the health of a community, the number of small businesses in a community directly seems to correlate with owner-occupied units. I do understand our challenges with gentrification, with income, but I think for a healthy community, we should be looking at owner-occupied rates going up, not down. And I think, I mean, you could probably speak on this better than I can, but for healthy communities, I've seen it above 70% for the owner occupied rates. And whatever that looks like as far as, townhouses or condos, but getting people to be able to afford to own is a priority for me. And so like in the context of this conversation, are we also talking about ways to increase ownership, owner occupied rates?
So the way I'd answer that is, are you looking for ways to increase owner occupied rates for households that have lower income?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll just start with that. That's hard and expensive, but I'm not saying the city shouldn't try it and shouldn't have policies around it, because I think the city should. But you also have to recognize that a healthy community is also one that has rental housing for people who work at lower wage jobs in the community as well, because not everybody who's lower wage is going to be able to own or necessarily wants to own, because there are some people who don't want to own. So I would say it's a mixture of both. Increasing, whether it changes your overall housing tenure, in other words, your overall rate of home ownership, increasing home ownership opportunities for people at the lower end of the income range is something that it's obviously a policy choice. I think it's I would put it in the should category, but I also don't should my cities too much. In other words, that's a policy decision. But that is one of the things that in the housing production strategy is under consideration. So this might be out of your scope too, so I apologize, but like the lease purchase flagship program, and I think Ohio is doing something. Do you have any information or data, like how we could take some of the numbers that you're talking about to specifically dedicate those towards low-income people being able to afford to buy here? And so you're hopping ahead to the policy discussion that we're in the middle of. Okay. So things like community land trusts, which I suspect is what you're referring to, are certainly part of the policy discussion. Okay. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Maybe a few comments. So Commissioner Edge and others involved in some of the policy discussions that are underway. I appreciate the presentation and the laying what feels like a really strong groundwork for those policy conversations, as well as policy conversations that could continue into the transportation system plan. I mean, one of the things I'm interested from this to better understand is those commute patterns for our estimated 752 people who live and work in Milwaukie. So maybe that's hopefully that's some information we could pull out of this to inform that. A few thoughts as I kind of mentioned in terms of, might the construction excise tax be able to be applied to single dwelling developments in order to potentially generate some resources that could be used for supporting more affordable housing, whether that's for renting or for owning. I was looking recently at transportation SDCs for the city of Milwaukie compared to other cities. And I think I noted a few other cities. Some of their system development charges are scaled by the square footage of the unit being developed. And so that could be a lever we might be able to pull in order to potentially help incent smaller units, which are more affordable. And then, I really, Beth, appreciate highlighting the increasing rental costs. I've mentioned it to this commission before, and I'll mention it again. There's 2 apartment complexes, one on King Road and another on Harvey Street, that are currently getting full renovations right now. And all the people that used to live there aren't living there anymore, as those apartments are getting updated and spruced up for the next set of renters, will probably be paying much higher rents. So change is already here, as I think we know. And I think the policy moves that Joseph and others are talking about are really important. I can't wait to hear more about them.
Laura, let me hand it back over to you. I can put the screen back up if we want, but it seemed like talking was better.
All right, does anybody else have anything that they want to add before we wrap this up for tonight? And then we'll be back, I think it's March 14th to get into the production strategies conversation.
Laura, I've got a question. It's one that's been on my mind for a while, even before I saw this presentation. But you know, we went through quite a bit of effort to incorporate House Bill into the middle housing efforts and the comp plan and the code adoption and everything like that. And I've always been interested to see, well, what did we achieve? And I think what I'm hearing tonight is we're not going to know for a while.
Or not.
Maybe 5 or 10 years out. And, I just want us to be deliberate about what we do when we decide to sample it and make, some big decisions. I don't know if we make big decisions based on this housing analysis or not, or do we wait for some real data in the real world with what we put into place is affecting things. So that's a general comment and a question. And what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that there's some things that we're going to have to do or identify as actual strategies for housing production as we're required to by the state. And the city's already been doing a lot of that work already through the Milwaukie housing affordability strategies. So we've already been doing some of that work and have been tracking that. We will still need to continue to do a little bit more because we actually have to come up with strategies, show them to the state, and then report back to them in 6 years as to how we're doing. So it's kind of like we can take this moment in time with the information that we have, also just that we did House Bill 2001, right? And then what are we going to try to do moving forward? And then we come back in 6 years and we analyze, have we made progress? What kind of progress have we made? What's working? What's not working? What do we need to tweak again? So it is a kind of a slow evolution of what we're trying to do using different levers.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Maybe a pile-on question here, Laura, to that comment. But Beth and Laura, is there any intent while we're waiting over these 6 years or during any of the next phases, looking ahead to compare data, new sets of data that might reflect differently, like I'm saying, on these pandemic years and new cycles of information that are coming in from these kind of national level resources and things like that you refer to in your report? I'm curious because it just seems like such a big shift for a lot of these data sets.
I was just going to say, we won't be doing kind of this deep dive on the data again until we redo the housing capacity analysis. But I think over time, if there's things that we can pull out, if we feel like there's new data, maybe that becomes available, we might be able to use. But I think we would want to also ask ourselves, to what end? What end will that data change what we're doing? Because right now we've just done this big thing with the code, right? That's a big lever that we don't know what the results are going to be. And then we're going to try some other levers and see how far we can get with that. So I really think that I don't know that the data is going to change what we do. It's more trying to decide what tools we have in our toolbox to move forward. And we've been really talking internally about, well, a lot of it has to do with how much resources do we have. It's money, right? I mean, getting people in affordable housing costs money. That's just straight up what the answer is. And where do we get that money from? That's a big question. And so trying to understand where that money is and how much we have or how much we can tap into. So it evolves, I think, over time and depends on what sort of resources that we have moving forward.
And I also add to that the housing production strategy is going to recommend a certain amount of monitoring, and that's monitoring of development and monitoring of the different strategies that we'll be looking at, the different actions. And Laura and I haven't talked about this yet, so hopefully it's not a surprise to her. But in 6 years, you'll be required to comment on were our actions effective. And so you have to have collected some data about that. 6 years is going to be a good, I mean, whatever we're going through in 6 years, there's going to be something that you look at and go, gosh, I wish this was done so I could tell what effect it has. It just happens that we're at a period where we've had done to us the pandemic and all of that wrought. And then House Bill 2001, it's just not going to be clear how that is going to grow into our communities for 5 to 10 years. So there'll be unanswered questions in 6 years when you do this again next, and things that you really wish you knew more about.
Speaking about monitoring and stuff, is there a way to require rental units to report when there's vacancies so we can track the real number of vacancies?
I don't think there is, Beth. Do you have a different answer for Commissioner?
I don't think so. I mean, for one thing, not all rental units are multi-dwelling. And so there's obviously quite a lot of rental units out there that are single dwelling units, and just even identifying all of those. Mm-hmm. What you can do is look at vacancy trends through a source like CoStar, or the apartment report's actually a pretty good source that's not very expensive for the city, that you can view vacancy trends for through. But I just don't think that it's practical to, I don't think that there's a policy lever, and then practical to collect all of that data from rental sources.
Not a very satisfying answer. I'm sorry.
I mean, there's other programmatic approaches the city could take if our elected officials and community wanted to around regulating rental units. Other communities have done that. There's clearly would be a programmatic cost for having to stand up and staff and manage a program. So it would be a much bigger conversation, well above our volunteer pay grade here. But others have made those choices.
You could also have staff do a vacancy survey every year. I'm just not sure that you'd come up with more satisfying information than you'd get through something like the apartment report.
So my concern, or just anecdotally, is that I've heard some people living in apartments that report, hey, my apartment complex has a lot of rentals open. And I know that there's some commercial properties that have just sat on their property and not lowered rent for numerous reasons. And I'm just curious to know what the real number is, as far as I understand it, as far as a single dwelling unit or house that somebody's remodeling or, holding on to for their, but I'm talking about apartment complexes that have more than 50 units or more than, so many units. Just how many of those are actually vacant? I'm just curious. And also, I guess that kind of goes to the commercial piece too. Like, why is it that, a investment company can own a bunch of commercial property and sit on it for years and keep it vacant?
Well, and I think to that
there are policy levers, Commissioner. There are policy levers like a vacancy tax, which I've heard municipalities have been exploring that recently. There's all kinds of things that are worth discussing that are different policy levers, but everything has side effects, and it is a deeper policy discussion that the city will have to get into about what its priorities are and how we really solve the larger sets of problems, because there are trade-offs to all of these different mechanisms.
So to our understanding, and we're not lawyers here at Echo Northwest, a vacancy tax probably isn't legal in Oregon. So places like Hood River and coastal cities have been talking more about vacancy taxes, and you can see, given, you know, second homes, that kind of thing, where their interest would be coming from. But if that became legal and there was some reasonable mechanism for it, then that does offer more.
Are you talking about commercial and residential? It's not legal?
I'm talking about residential. I don't know about commercial with the vacancy tax. I haven't heard of one, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist in Oregon.
Maybe a follow-up question, Beth. I'd maybe like to hear a little bit more. You had mentioned, I think in your presentation near the end, about high density maybe not performing as well as it could. Could you share a little bit more color on that?
Well, I haven't dug into your code to look at some of the reasons. So I hate to comment too much, but Laura may have some specific thoughts on this. But your high density is just not developing at the densities that I would expect, and it may be that you allow single dwelling development in it, and that's what owners have wanted to develop. Or there may be other reasons. Essentially, if Laura doesn't know, we just need to dig into the code.
We can get into kind of talking about that, but right now, yeah, it's super low density because we actually have really low densities. Our high density zoning is not high density; it's low density.
Yeah, and this is reminding me. I think we might have even been talking at one of our previous meetings about high density, about maybe not allowing single dwellings as an allowed use. Okay, thanks, Beth. I appreciate that.
That's the kind of solution that I've recommended to other communities.
All right. Well, lots of good, meaty, juicy conversations to come.
Yeah.
And with that, if nobody else has any further questions on this particular topic, I think I would let Beth go for the evening.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a wealth
great
of information.
presentation.
Thank you so much.
I want to share that with the community.
And maybe we could share at least that portion of the packet with our land use chairs.
Yeah.
And maybe when we
as well.
And maybe when we have an event like this that kind of gives this overall thing where it's just kind of, maybe we could invite our land use chairs to join us either via Zoom or in the audience. Might be a good way to connect with them.
Maybe for that March 14th meeting.
Mm-hmm.
That I love that idea. It would be great to extend almost a personal invitation to let them know there's a special agenda item, you know, that would have hopefully interest to them.
We can do that.
Thank you, Beth. Good night, and we'll look forward to the next step here.
Thanks, Beth.
Thank you, Beth.
Thanks.
And thank you to Vice Chair Edge for sitting in and, you know, representing the commission and during these conversations and advocating, and appreciate any kind of sharing back that you can do between meetings, whether it's during the CIAC or during other business on our agenda. But if you could, just keep us informed between now and March.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, as we continue to have these meetings and we get more into the policy focus rather than the fact-finding focus, which is really where we have been. And what we saw tonight was really just the presentation of that fact-finding. And so now we get into the interesting things, which, well, I mean, not that the facts aren't interesting, but we get into the interesting work, which is, you know, how do we take those facts and then, you know, use the levers that we have available to us to, you know, try to solve problems. And so now that we're getting into this part of it, I would expect that I'll have more to say to the commission following these meetings. So yeah, I do expect updates as we move forward.
Laura, I just had a thought, and it was just curious, kind of the lens of our DEI director within the city, and then the title is not correct, but just wondering what type of oversight or review, if any, during this process that individual might have.
Yeah, actually, we have met with equity. We didn't do a recap of the outreach that we've done. Somehow that failed, that did not make it in this presentation. So we'll be sure to do that, because we did have a meeting with the Equity Steering Committee and talked through all of these ideas. And we also have an equity person who's a representative on the committee. So we have been going and talking to them. And then we also did a community-wide survey about housing questions, kind of people's experience with housing in Milwaukie. And we had over 200 respondents. It's one of the best response rates we've had since COVID.
How did we not hear about that tonight?
Yeah, I don't know. I thought that was in the presentation.
It was in the report.
Was it in the report?
It
Somehow it didn't get translated. I thought that there was a placeholder for that. So my apologies. We did talk about that and actually had a conversation about including it, but somehow it didn't make it in. So we will report out next time, but it was a really good response rate. And so we are doing that outreach, and we'll continue to do that outreach. We were going to have some developer focus groups, and then trying to get developer focus groups that work with underrepresented communities. We're going to have a focus group with those folks. And then I just said focus groups, focus a lot of times, but anyway. And then also we're exploring whether or not we're going to do some further engagement to our BIPOC population, but we're really trying to focus on what specific questions will we be asking that are different than the general questions we'd be asking people in Milwaukie. So we're still working through some of that. So we will bring that to you and give you a little bit more information about that. And my sincere apologies that we did not cover that in the presentation.
Yeah, and
there was plenty of meat on that bone tonight, so not a problem, but I think it's worth spending a few slides just to make sure that the public is well informed about the process. Sounds like you all are doing that good work.
Yeah,
100%. Thank you.
Yeah, and on the one slide that they showed the breakdown of the demographics, there was no data for Black, and there was no data for Pacific Islander or whatever. The Clackamas County data was there, but there was no data for Milwaukie.
It's really hard. We've been doing deep dive into data. What we can get, it's too small. So we really did dig into that. So in the report, if you look in the report, that question, we asked that internally, and we talked to the consultant about it. So what's in the report is what we're actually able to get our hands on.
Well, there was no blue bar that even got any, well, at any rate, it doesn't matter. But, and what we can see is that, and I don't want to tell anybody what BIPOC means or says. That's not my pay grade. But as we can see that the Asian community is certainly an outlier towards even to the median of of white or to any other group. So I don't know. I don't know how that gets reconciled, right? I mean, because if you just throw everybody into an average or into a skew and call it good, and I think that each individual group has certainly different needs that, you know, let's not just categorize them as other, but let's, let's not throw our own personal biases into it as well, because we all do want to have the same needs and desires regardless of our race, color. It's more socioeconomic than it is anything else.
Yep. And in the survey results, we can kind of dice it to break it down, some of the responses based on how they identified by race. So there are some, we can do a little bit of deep diving into that. And we have kind of we have an overview of that, but we haven't published it yet. So once we have that, I will be sure to send it. We'll figure out the best mechanism to get it out to you and to other people.
Hey, Laura, I have a question about the survey. Was that done through the Engagement Milwaukie?
Yes, it was.
Okay. In our last meeting, there were some questions, or I raised some questions, and I think one or two people from NDA about removing barriers from using the Engage Milwaukie. Has there been any feedback or response or tracking on that item?
That is a policy discussion that would need to be taken up at a higher level. As I know that we had Jason come in on October 11th and talk about the city had made some policy choices about how to manage how we're tracking data, and that it is what it is at the moment. But those conversations have been had in this room and in other rooms, and until there's a moment, I think, when at a higher level than us decides that we want to revisit how we're managing and using Engage Milwaukie and what we're requiring. That's kind of, I guess, above my pay grade, quite frankly.
Well, it's not your department's problem.
It's not my department. Yeah, we don't actually, that was more of the questions that were kind of targeted or discussed with Jason. And I think Jason kind of gave the response that this is something that the city had decided to do. And they hear what folks are saying, but I don't know that they have decided to address potential changes to that. I did not get an impression from Jason.
Yeah, I heard pretty consistently from Jason that resistance to make any change. So it sounds to me, Laura, if I were to make a guess here, that all an individual would need to do is to attend a future city council meeting and get themselves on the agenda to raise the point.
Yes, you could.
And to ask city council to take directive and recognize the issue as being raised.
I think that is wise advice.
Okay. It's put out there. I think that's definitely the method. Other thoughts or comments? Because I'd like to move us on the agenda.
This is for our future counselor. As we saw, using our utility bill as a tax device is very counterproductive to housing affordability.
What?
Nothing.
All
Robert
right.
understands what I mean.
Okay.
I understand what you mean, but
I'm going to move on. So talking through now whether or not we have any, I think we've kind of covered other discussion items, but I'm going to ask it once. Are there other business updates?
Well, it's not a business update. I just have a little bit of news I'd like to share, if that's okay at this point. I'm not sure about
Sure.
the news. Okay. So, we've been grappling with dealing with housing needs and variances tonight, but let me talk about some fun things. And I think everyone knows that, there's been a contract signed with a developer for the reuse of this building, the City Hall. And I was glad to see that, but there weren't a lot of details. But, at the historic neighborhood meeting last night, and Greg and I were both there, we got a lot of details on it, and it's really exciting. And I guess I should have asked this question last night, is that are we going to share that on a wider scale? Does anyone know?
I don't know what the level of disclosure is, what sort of agreement is going on. So there was an article in one of the papers that talked about what the potential.
it was a copy of the press release, the article.
Yeah, we saw floor
reporters.
plans and names, and man, it was.
I haven't even seen that. So.
Yeah. So at any rate, I hope that comes out. But at a future date, we're not going to be holding a meeting here. We're going to be enjoying some great coffee and baked goods in this room. Just in this room.
Pizza and beer in the firehouse.
Right.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. But this developer has done this at a number of locations around the area, and had some interesting stories about not only repurposing, the existing building, but sort of an economic driver for the whole area.
Oh yeah, I think it will be really.
Is there a safe in this building? I know that some buildings in the repurpose, they always do something fun in an old safe.
I don't know the answer to that, but at any rate, we're looking for some fun in this building. Yeah.
Parking? Do we even know?
Yeah, what's happening with the parking right here?
City's maintaining that.
City still, so this sale was literally only the footprint of the building.
Yep.
Okay.
So the parking lot is still owned by the city.
Yeah.
The sculpture garden is still owned by the city. The tree that gets lit every year is still owned by the city. And then I don't know who owns the grassy knoll out there, if it's the school district or if it's the city of Milwaukie or how that all works out
Whoever's
together.
got a dog and a baby who wants to go out and spread out a blanket. that's
Right.
who owns it.
But everything from the sidewalk to the building becomes the property. So no more scarecrow
Yeah, did you
contests.
see the
in the
request? That was the biggest request of the community. They had the list of demands. It was to keep the Halloween decorations out.
Well, they could put it on the sideline if they want.
But everybody seemed really excited about it.
So we probably got outside of our lane tonight, but I was so excited to hear all these details that I wanted to share
Great.
what we found out last night. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm excited. I did see that, but was hoping for greater detail.
And good point. You know what
So
I can
thank
try
you.
to do is see if I can put that information in the NDA newsletter at the beginning of next year so that is shared more broadly
Yep,
as
yep.
opposed to having.
I mean, they've got a presentation, maybe
Sure.
the developer's willing to share it. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
And I know that the chair of the historic NDA asked for the slides to be delivered, and he had no problem with giving the slides. So.
All right, then.
That'd be fun.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I
Good
would
to
love
know.
You
to
guys
see
get
it.
a hold of it, post it in group because the community would love to see that.
As Chair Losfeld might say, it's going to be transformative.
Thank you. We already have fun in this building, Commissioner Massey. What are you talking about?
Well, you're right. Just a different kind of fun. We'll be having
that's
this
right.
kind of fun down the street.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else?
I just want to share that I started a community calendar that I'm going to test out doing for a few months. So I'm putting NDA meetings, city meetings. It's a community calendar that also has like restaurant stuff and a bunch of stuff. We have categories. So if anybody wants events put on there, or if I miss a city meeting or an NDA, let me know and I'll do it.
Awesome. Okay, let's see. Just one more final send off for Commissioner Massey and appreciation of your commitment and service to the Planning Commission. Appreciate all of your great insights, your feedback during our discussions as a commission and leadership. So thank you very much. I think everybody on the commission appreciates your years of service here. So thank you.
It was a real pleasure to serve with all of you, and it's not going to stop because there's a lot of points of intersection between the Planning Commission and City Council. So I look forward to that continued
right.
relationship. Thanks again.
Thank you. All right, Laura, forecast for future meetings.
Forecast for future meetings, the fun last thing of every single meeting. January 10th, we have a conditional use for another vacation rental hearing item. And then the work session, Ryan's going to be back with the climate-friendly, equitable communities follow-up from our last meeting. And then also, I know that you all have gone through this before, so code fix housekeeping things. We have a running list of housekeeping things in the code that aren't substantive, but are just little tiny tweaks that need to be made, inconsistencies. Ryan's been working so hard on them. Vera's actually going to bring them to you, but so we're going to bring that first work session to you on those.
Is one of it going to be a 3-foot property line in the NMNU?
That is on our code fix list now. It's not in there yet, but maybe it could be. We've got a list now. It's a big list, and we've been breaking it down into categories, and it's complicated.
So fun.
So yes, we will start to bring that to you. I won't be here on the 10th, so it'll be Ryan and Vera running the show. So, and then
Laura.
yes, sorry.
Just finish your thought. I was
just gonna say, and then we'll be back on the 24th with the downtown design review to talk about art. So that's on the 24th, and that's it.
Yay. Oh. Just a general excitement that we're bringing that topic up again. I have a question for you, Laura. I was wondering whether you could send out to the commission our work plan forecast.
Yes, I can do that. Well, you know, I do that every year. We kind of have that joint meeting with, I have that. And it'll be interesting. It might behoove us to wait a little bit further into getting the new council in and seeing what their goals are going to be and whether or not the forecast is going to shift at all. But I could, in the meantime, though, if you wanted me to show you what the work plan looks like now, I'm always happy to show that to you.
Yeah, I feel like I just want to get my eyes on it, kind of understand what we have ahead of us for the new year. That would be awesome.
I can do that. Sure.
Okay. Appreciate that.
Yep.
Okay. I think you were at the end of your list there.
I am. Thank you.
Okay, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move that we
I move we
adjourn.
adjourn.
Nice. Are there any seconds?
Second.
Don't do it.
I don't know who got that out first, but I'll second Matthew.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Likewise.
That's right. I'll see you in the new year.